Nobody expected this moment, an on-air clash so tense, it stopped the show cold. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, and a friendly daytime interview slowly shifts into something noticeably tense, right in front of a studio audience that can feel the mood changing in real time? Make sure to subscribe to Table Turn, and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. On this particular morning, the set looks exactly like it always does. Bright lights, a polished table, warm applause as the hosts welcome viewers back from commercial. Nothing about the opening moments suggests anything out of the ordinary. The conversation begins in a familiar place, with the panel introducing Robert Downey Jr. as the guest of the day, highlighting his long career, recent projects, and the kind of legacy he's built in Hollywood over decades. It's the type of introduction that's meant to ease both the guest and the audience into a relaxed discussion, and at first, that's exactly how it feels. Downey walks out smiling, waving briefly to the crowd, exchanging quick greetings with the panel as he takes a seat. The studio audience reacts warmly, clapping a bit longer than usual, clearly excited to see him in person. The hosts thank him for being there, and the early exchange is light. They talk about his work ethic, how he balances public life with privacy, and how the industry has changed since his early days. The tone is casual, friendly, and measured, just like viewers expect from a daytime talk show. Whoopi Goldberg, seated at the center of the table, leads much of this early conversation. She's calm, attentive, occasionally nodding as Downey speaks, letting him finish his thoughts. The other hosts chime in with short comments and affirmations, adding laughter here and there. At this stage, the segment feels like a standard celebrity interview, the kind that blends promotion with reflection and a little personal insight. The shift doesn't happen all at once. It starts subtly, almost quietly, as the discussion moves toward broader topics. The panel transitions from Downey's latest work into a conversation about responsibility in Hollywood, how public figures are expected to address social issues, and what it means to use a platform responsibly. This is familiar territory for the show, and it's a topic they've covered many times before with many guests. Downey responds thoughtfully at first, choosing his words carefully. He talks about growth, about learning over time, about how he tries to focus on his work while being mindful of the impact he has. His tone remains even, his body language relaxed, leaning slightly forward as he speaks, hands occasionally moving to emphasize a point. Whoopi listens closely, then follows up with a question that reframes the topic slightly. She brings up the idea that silence from influential figures can sometimes be interpreted as avoidance, especially during moments when audiences expect clarity or leadership. It's not an accusation, but it's more pointed than the earlier questions. Her voice remains steady, but the phrasing is firmer, and the room feels a bit quieter as she finishes. Downey pauses before answering. It's a noticeable pause, not uncomfortable yet, but long enough for viewers to sense that he's weighing how to respond. He begins by acknowledging the point, saying he understands why people feel that way, but then adds that he believes there's a difference between thoughtful engagement and reacting under pressure. As he speaks, his tone becomes more deliberate, less conversational, as if he's moving from storytelling into explanation. One of the other hosts jumps in briefly, trying to soften the moment, suggesting that everyone approaches public responsibility differently. There's a small ripple of agreement from the panel, and for a second, it seems like the conversation might settle back into safer ground. But Whoopi isn't finished. She follows up again, this time more directly, referencing past moments when public figures were criticized for not speaking out. She emphasizes the influence celebrities have, especially on younger audiences, and questions whether choosing not to engage publicly can sometimes do more harm than good. Her posture straightens slightly, and she looks directly at Downey as she speaks. The studio audience grows noticeably quieter. You can sense the shift not just in what's being said, but in how it's being received. Downey's expression tightens just a bit. He remains composed, but the casual smile from earlier is gone. He responds by clarifying that he doesn't see restraint as indifference, and that he believes meaningful action doesn't always happen on camera or on social media. As he talks, Whoopi interjects, not loudly but firmly, clarifying that public accountability is part of the territory when someone chooses a public life. The interruption is brief, but it changes the rhythm of the exchange. Downey stops mid-sentence, then continues, adjusting his point, but now the back and forth is more apparent. Another host attempts to redirect, suggesting they pivot back to Downey's work or upcoming projects. There's a slight laugh from the audience, a kind of nervous release, but Whoopi gestures subtly, signaling she wants to finish the thought. She reiterates her stance, saying that while she respects personal boundaries, she also believes that influence comes with responsibility whether one asks for it or not. Downey responds again, this time with a sharper edge in his voice, though he remains controlled. He says he respects differing opinions, but doesn't agree with being expected to comment on every issue, especially when nuance gets lost in public discourse. He emphasizes that his choices are intentional, not dismissive. The tension is now clearly visible. Downey sits back slightly in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, a posture that suggests both composure and distance. Whoopi maintains eye contact, her expression serious but not hostile. The audience watches closely, sensing that this is no longer just a friendly discussion but a genuine disagreement unfolding live. As the exchange continues, the pacing slows. There are longer pauses between responses, fewer interruptions from the other hosts, who now seem to be watching carefully, ready to step in if needed. The conversation hasn't crossed any lines, but it's walking close to them, the way live television sometimes does when real perspectives collide. By the end of this first stretch of the segment, it's clear that what began as a routine interview has shifted into something more complex. The disagreement hasn't exploded, but it's simmering, and both Downey and Whoopi appear firmly rooted in their positions. The studio audience remains attentive, unsure whether to applaud, laugh, or stay silent, mirroring the uncertainty that often accompanies moments like this on live daytime television. And as the show heads toward its next break, the tension lingers unresolved, setting the stage for what's about to come next. When the show comes back from commercial, there's a noticeable shift in the atmosphere, even before anyone speaks. The applause as the hosts and Robert Downey Jr. reappear is still there, but it's shorter, more restrained, as if the audience is aware they're stepping back into an ongoing conversation rather than a fresh, upbeat segment. Everyone at the table adjusts slightly in their seats, and for a brief moment, no one rushes to fill the silence. Whoopi is the first to speak, calmly recentering the discussion. She thanks Downey for staying with the conversation and acknowledges that these topics can be complicated. Her tone is measured, almost conciliatory, but the seriousness remains. She explains that the show often invites guests not just to promote work, but to engage in conversations that reflect what viewers are talking about at home. Downey nods as she speaks, offering a small smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes. He says he understands the format of the show and respects the panel for having these discussions openly. His voice is steady, but there's a sense that he's now being more guarded with his words, choosing them carefully, as if aware that anything he says could push the conversation further in one direction or another. Another host tries to widen the lens, asking whether there's a difference between speaking as an individual and being seen as a representative of something larger, whether that's an industry, a movement, or a fan base. It's a thoughtful question, and for a moment, the tension eases slightly as Downey engages with it more comfortably, explaining that the expectations placed on public figures can sometimes flatten complex personal views into simple headlines. As he speaks, the audience murmurs softly, a few nods visible in the crowd. The exchange feels almost reflective again, as though the conversation might settle into a balanced discussion of nuance and perspective. Whoopi listens without interrupting this time, hands folded loosely on the table, eyes focused on Downey. But when he finishes, she leans forward slightly and responds, pointing out that while nuance is important, television itself is a medium built on conversation, not perfection. She says viewers don't always expect flawless answers, but they do expect honesty and presence. Her voice remains calm, but her words are firm, and she emphasizes that engaging publicly doesn't have to mean having all the answers. Downey exhales quietly before responding, a small gesture that doesn't go unnoticed. He says he appreciates that perspective, but reiterates that he doesn't believe every conversation belongs on a public platform. He mentions the pressure to perform sincerity and how that pressure can sometimes lead to statements that feel more reactive than meaningful. At this point, the back and forth becomes more direct. Whoopi counters that choosing not to engage is also a choice that sends a message, whether intended or not. She speaks from her own experience, referencing years in the public eye and moments when she felt compelled to speak despite discomfort. The studio audience reacts audibly, some clapping lightly, others remaining quiet. Downey shifts in his chair, uncrossing and recrossing his legs, a subtle sign of restlessness. He responds by saying he doesn't dismiss that experience, but doesn't believe there's a single correct approach. His tone sharpens slightly, not aggressive, but more emphatic. He says personal growth and accountability don't always need to be visible to be real. One of the hosts attempts to bridge the gap, suggesting that perhaps the disagreement is less about responsibility and more about method. She smiles gently, hoping to ease the tension, and asks whether both approaches can coexist. There's a brief moment where both Downey and Whoopi pause, considering the reframing. Whoopi nods slowly, acknowledging the point, but adds that the reason she presses the issue is because of the influence the show sees every day. She says viewers often look to familiar faces for reassurance, especially during uncertain times, and silence can feel isolating to those audiences. Her voice softens slightly here, and the tone becomes more personal. Downey listens, his expression thoughtful, but still reserved. When he responds, he says he doesn't want anyone to feel ignored or dismissed, but he also doesn't want to contribute to what he describes as a cycle of performative outrage. He stresses that he prefers to engage privately, through actions rather than statements, and that public discourse can sometimes oversimplify complex realities. The studio audience remains divided in its reactions. A few people applaud softly, others remain silent, and there's a palpable sense that viewers are processing both sides. The hosts glance at each other, aware that the segment is running longer than planned and that the conversation has moved far beyond its original scope. Whoopi interjects again, this time more pointedly, saying that while private action is valuable, public acknowledgement can validate shared experiences. She asks Downey directly whether he believes public figures have an obligation to meet audiences where they are. The question hangs in the air, direct and unavoidable. Downey's response is slower this time. He says he believes obligation is a strong word and that expectations should not override personal boundaries. His voice is still controlled, but the warmth from earlier in the segment is largely gone. He emphasizes respect, both for audiences and for individual autonomy. As he finishes, there's a brief silence. No one jumps in immediately, and the camera lingers on the table, capturing the subtle shifts in posture and expression. Whoopi looks thoughtful, not confrontational, but clearly unsatisfied. The other hosts exchange quick glances, silently negotiating how to move forward. Finally, Whoopi speaks again, acknowledging the difference in perspective and saying that disagreement doesn't mean disrespect. She reiterates that these conversations matter because they reflect broader cultural debates. Her tone suggests she's trying to bring the moment back to a place of mutual understanding, even if resolution isn't possible. Downey nods, but his body language suggests a growing discomfort. He sits back more fully now, hands resting on the armrests of his chair, creating a slight physical distance between himself and the table. He says he appreciates the opportunity to explain his view, even if they don't agree. As the segment approaches another transition point, it's clear that the conversation has reached a delicate balance. The disagreement hasn't escalated into shouting or overt conflict, but the tension is unmistakable. Viewers at home can likely feel it just as strongly as those in the studio, aware that live television is capturing a genuine clash of perspectives, unfolding moment by moment. And as the hosts prepare to either redirect or conclude the discussion, the question remains whether this moment will settle quietly or tip into something more abrupt. As the conversation continues, there's a noticeable effort from the panel to steady the pace, but the underlying tension doesn't fully lift. The hosts shift slightly in their chairs, adjusting papers on the table, glancing toward the studio monitors, all the small movements that signal awareness of time and tone on live television. The audience remains quiet, attentive in a way that feels different from earlier applause-heavy moments. One of the co-hosts steps in again, this time with a softer entry point, suggesting that perhaps the conversation reflects a broader cultural shift in expectations. She frames it as a generational issue, noting that audiences today often expect immediate responses from public figures, while earlier eras allowed more distance. It's an attempt to contextualize the disagreement rather than resolve it, and for a brief moment, both Whoopi and Downey seem willing to engage on that level. Downey responds first, agreeing that expectations have changed dramatically. He speaks about how constant visibility can blur the line between a person's work and their personal convictions. His voice steadies again, returning to a more explanatory tone, and he gestures lightly with his hands as he speaks, as if trying to clarify rather than defend. Whoopi listens, nodding occasionally, but when she responds, she brings the focus back to accountability. She acknowledges the generational shift, but emphasizes that influence has always come with scrutiny, even if the platforms have changed. She says the difference now is that audiences can speak back instantly, and that dynamic shapes how silence is interpreted. The exchange remains civil, but the rhythm is tighter now. There's less space between responses, fewer pauses to breathe. Downey's answers become shorter, more precise, as though he's narrowing his points to avoid further escalation. He reiterates that he believes in thoughtful engagement and that he's cautious about contributing to conversations when he feels unprepared to do them justice. At one point, Whoopi interrupts gently, not to challenge, but to clarify. She says she's not questioning his intentions, but rather the impact of public absence during critical moments. Her tone is firm but measured, and she stresses that viewers often project meaning onto silence, regardless of intent. Downey's reaction is subtle but noticeable. He tilts his head slightly, takes a breath, and responds that intent still matters, even if perception doesn't always align with it. He says he struggles with the idea that public figures are obligated to perform their values on demand. The word perform lands heavily, and a few audience members shift in their seats. Another host tries to interject with a light comment, perhaps hoping to ease the mood, but it doesn't quite land. The laughter is minimal, polite at best. The conversation has reached a point where humor feels out of place, and everyone at the table seems to recognize that. Whoopi addresses Downey directly again, her voice calm but unwavering. She says that from her perspective, speaking out isn't about performance but about participation. She references the show's role as a forum for dialogue, emphasizing that disagreement is part of that process. She adds that viewers don't expect perfection, just engagement. Downey responds with a nod, but his expression remains guarded. He says he understands that viewpoint, but doesn't fully share it. He mentions that he's seen how quickly public statements can be misinterpreted or weaponized, and that caution isn't avoidance, but a form of responsibility in itself. The studio audience reacts unevenly. A small cluster applauds softly, while others remain silent. The lack of a unified response underscores how divided the issue is, even in the room. The camera cuts briefly to the audience, capturing attentive faces, some nodding, others impassive. As the conversation continues, Whoopi's questions become less about challenging Downey's stance and more about exploring its implications. She asks whether there's a middle ground between silence and constant commentary. It's a thoughtful question, and for a moment, the tension eases slightly as Downey considers it. He answers that he's still searching for that balance himself. He says the pressure to respond publicly can sometimes drown out quieter, more meaningful work happening behind the scenes. His tone softens here, and there's a hint of vulnerability as he admits that navigating public expectations isn't something he's fully resolved. Whoopi acknowledges this, nodding slowly. She says that uncertainty is understandable, but reiterates that the audience's expectations don't disappear simply because the situation is complex. She emphasizes empathy, both for public figures and for viewers seeking connection. The exchange reaches a point where repetition begins to creep in. Both sides have articulated their positions clearly, and the disagreement feels less like a debate and more like two parallel perspectives that aren't fully intersecting. The hosts seem aware of this, and one of them glances toward the control room, likely signaling that the segment needs to move forward. Downey shifts again in his chair, leaning back further now, his arms resting more rigidly. The physical distance between him and the table has grown, and while he remains polite, there's a visible withdrawal. He responds to the next question briefly, reiterating his respect for the panel while standing by his views. Whoopi's final comment in this stretch is reflective rather than confrontational. She says conversations like this are important precisely because they don't always end in agreement. Her voice softens, and she emphasizes that the goal isn't to corner guests but to explore ideas openly. Downey nods in response, but there's a sense that he's reaching his limit. His answers become more succinct, and he avoids expanding further. The other hosts pick up on this shift, beginning to pivot toward wrapping up the discussion. As the segment approaches its next natural pause, the atmosphere remains tense but controlled. No one has raised their voice, no harsh words have been exchanged, yet the emotional weight of the conversation is evident. Viewers watching live can likely sense that something unresolved lingers beneath the surface, setting the stage for a decision point that's still to come. And as the show moves closer to the end of this portion of the discussion, the question isn't whether the disagreement will be resolved, but how it will ultimately conclude on live television. As the conversation moves forward, the production clearly tries to guide things toward a close, but the momentum of the discussion makes that difficult. There's a subtle tightening in the pacing, with shorter questions and more controlled responses, the kind of adjustment viewers familiar with live daytime television can recognize immediately. The hosts are aware that time is limited, but the emotional weight of what's been said so far makes a clean transition challenging. One of the co-hosts offers a summarizing comment, attempting to reflect both perspectives without taking a side. She mentions that conversations about public responsibility are evolving, and that there isn't a single roadmap for navigating them. Her tone is neutral, almost mediator-like, and she glances briefly between Whoopi and Downey as she speaks. Downey nods politely, offering a brief acknowledgement. He thanks the panel for the opportunity to discuss the issue openly. His voice is calm, but there's a noticeable restraint in his delivery now, as if he's consciously holding back from elaborating further. His posture remains leaned back, shoulders slightly squared, signaling a desire to disengage rather than escalate. Whoopi responds by agreeing that there's no single answer, but she adds one more point, carefully phrased yet unmistakably firm. She says that when people invite public attention, whether through art, media, or influence, they also inherit a responsibility to show up during difficult moments. Her tone isn't confrontational, but it's direct, and it reframes the conversation one final time from her perspective. The studio audience reacts with a low murmur, a mix of light applause and quiet stillness. It's clear that many are invested in the exchange, even if they're unsure how to respond. The cameras linger briefly on Downey's face as he listens, capturing a subtle tightening of his jaw and a brief downward glance before he looks back up. Downey responds slowly. He says he respects Whoopi's experience and her viewpoint, but that he fundamentally disagrees with the idea that public visibility automatically equates to obligation. He emphasizes that choosing when and how to speak is part of maintaining personal integrity. His voice remains even, but the emotional distance is more pronounced now. As he finishes, Whoopi interjects again, this time more sharply than before, clarifying that obligation doesn't mean constant commentary, but presence when it matters. The interruption is brief, but it lands heavily. Downey stops mid-thought, pauses, then resumes, adjusting his wording but clearly frustrated by the repeated reframing. He says that from his perspective, being pressured to speak publicly undermines the sincerity of the message itself. He adds that he doesn't believe silence should automatically be interpreted as indifference. The words are measured, but the tension in his voice is unmistakable. Another host attempts to step in, suggesting they agree to disagree and move on. She smiles gently, hoping to defuse the moment, but the timing feels late. The conversation has already reached a point where the emotional stakes are clear, and Downey appears increasingly uncomfortable. Whoopi responds to the attempt to redirect by saying that disagreement is healthy and that discomfort isn't something to avoid in meaningful conversations. Her voice remains steady, but there's a firmness that suggests she's unwilling to soften her stance further. She emphasizes that the show exists to ask difficult questions, even when the answers aren't easy. Downey shifts again, this time more noticeably. He leans forward briefly, then back, as if deciding whether to continue engaging. He says he understands the purpose of the show, but that he feels the conversation is circling without resolution. His tone is still polite, but there's a clear edge of frustration now. The audience grows very quiet. There's no applause, no laughter, just attentive silence. The weight of the moment is palpable, and viewers at home would likely feel it as well. This is no longer just a philosophical disagreement. It's a moment where personal boundaries are being tested on live television. Whoopi responds by saying that not all conversations are meant to resolve neatly. She reiterates that the goal is dialogue, not consensus. Her expression is serious, but not angry. She maintains eye contact with Downey, signaling that she's engaged, not attacking. Downey takes a breath, then speaks again, this time more succinctly. He says he's shared his perspective clearly and doesn't feel there's much more he can add. He thanks the panel again, but the phrasing sounds final, as if he's preparing to disengage altogether. The hosts exchange quick glances. One of them lightly suggests moving to the next segment, acknowledging the time constraint. The comment is delivered casually, but the tension beneath it is evident. Whoopi nods, but adds one last remark, saying that conversations like this are exactly why the show exists, even when they're uncomfortable. She thanks Downey for participating, but her tone suggests she still feels the issue is unresolved. Downey responds with a brief nod and a tight smile. He shifts in his chair, placing his hands on the armrests, a gesture that reads as preparatory. He says, calmly but firmly, that he appreciates the discussion but needs to step away. The phrasing is understated, not dramatic, but unexpected. There's a moment of confusion at the table. One of the hosts asks if he means stepping away from the conversation or the segment. Downey clarifies that he's going to excuse himself. His voice remains controlled, but the decision is clear. The studio audience reacts audibly now, a mix of surprised murmurs and scattered applause. Whoopi looks momentarily taken aback, then composes herself, nodding slowly. She says she respects his decision, though her expression suggests disappointment. Downey stands up, adjusting his jacket as he does. He thanks the hosts again, briefly acknowledging the audience. The movement is calm, not abrupt, but the significance of it is unmistakable. A guest leaving mid-segment is rare, and everyone in the room seems to understand that this moment will be remembered. As he steps away from the table and begins to exit the set, the cameras struggle momentarily to adjust, cutting between the panel and Downey as he walks off. The hosts remain seated, visibly processing what's just happened. And as the show prepares to move forward without him, the atmosphere is heavy with the awareness that a routine daytime conversation has crossed into something far more complicated, setting the stage for reactions that will extend well beyond the studio walls. As the cameras settle back on the table, there's a brief pause that feels longer than it actually is. Live television doesn't allow much room for processing, but in this moment, it's clear that everyone on set is taking a second to recalibrate. The audience remains quiet, unsure whether to applaud, react, or simply wait for guidance. The hosts exchange subtle looks, the kind that happen when something unexpected has just occurred and the show needs to move forward without calling too much attention to it. Whoopi is the first to speak. Her tone is composed, steady, and professional. She acknowledges that live conversations don't always unfold the way anyone expects, and that differing perspectives can sometimes lead to difficult moments. She thanks the audience for staying with them and reminds viewers that the show is a place for open dialogue, even when that dialogue becomes uncomfortable. Another host follows up by gently redirecting the energy, saying that these moments reflect the reality of live discussion and that not every conversation ends neatly. She offers a brief transition toward the next planned topic, but her voice carries a seriousness that wasn't there earlier in the episode. The audience responds with polite applause, more out of support than enthusiasm. It's clear that everyone in the room understands they've just witnessed something unusual. The show moves on, but the mood remains subdued for the rest of the segment. Laughter is softer, comments are more measured, and the earlier sense of ease doesn't fully return. As the episode continues, The hosts avoid referencing the walk-off directly, focusing instead on lighter topics and scheduled discussions. Still, there's an underlying awareness that the earlier exchange has left an impression, not just on the panel but on viewers at home. When the episode eventually wraps, there's no dramatic sign-off or acknowledgement of what happened earlier. The closing feels routine on the surface, but the tone is noticeably restrained. The audience applauds as the credits roll, but the energy is quieter than usual, as if people are still replaying the moment in their minds. Almost immediately after the episode airs, reactions begin to surface online. Viewers take to social media to share their thoughts, many expressing surprise at seeing a guest leave mid-segment. Some praise Whoopi for standing her ground and asking difficult questions, emphasizing the importance of accountability and open dialogue. Others sympathize with Downey, arguing that he was put in an uncomfortable position and had every right to step away when the conversation no longer felt productive. Clips of the exchange circulate quickly, with viewers dissecting body language, tone, and specific phrases. Some note the gradual escalation, pointing out that the disagreement built slowly rather than exploding suddenly. Others comment on how rare it is to see tension like that unfold so calmly, yet decisively on a daytime talk show. Entertainment commentators weigh in as well, framing the moment as an example of the challenges live television faces when serious topics intersect with celebrity interviews. Several point out that neither side raised their voice or resorted to personal attacks, emphasizing that the clash was rooted in differing philosophies rather than hostility. In the hours that follow, sources close to the show clarify that the segment wasn't scripted and that no one anticipated Downey leaving early. They reiterate that the panel's role is to engage guests in honest conversation and that disagreements, while uncomfortable, are part of that process. The show doesn't issue an apology or a formal statement, choosing instead to let the episode speak for itself. Downey, for his part, doesn't immediately comment publicly. His representatives later indicate that he appreciated the opportunity to appear on the show but felt the conversation had reached a point where stepping away was the best choice for him personally. This statement is brief, respectful, and avoids placing blame. In the days that follow, the moment continues to be discussed, not because of shouting or spectacle, but because of its restraint. Viewers remark on how the tension was conveyed through pauses, interruptions, and body language rather than dramatic outbursts. It becomes a talking point about how live television can still produce unscripted, meaningful moments in an era where much content feels carefully managed. For many, the exchange serves as a reminder that disagreement doesn't always look explosive. Sometimes it's quiet, measured, and unresolved. And sometimes, walking away is as much a statement as staying and continuing the conversation. As the discussion gradually fades from headlines, it leaves behind a broader question for viewers to consider. How much do we expect from public figures, and where do we draw the line between accountability and personal boundaries? It's not a question with an easy answer, and perhaps that's why the moment resonated with so many people watching. And now, we want to hear from you. What did you think about how the conversation unfolded and how it ended? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories.